always a fan of having the tech space first full, right? So if I'm looking to force growth or grow my company, before looking at expanding my sales team to accommodate a larger sales funnel, I'm always bringing techs in to accommodate higher volume of machines first. My personal opinion with that, and the reason that I'm looking at that particular style or that particular path to hiring, is I always feel like even if sales is a little bit disorganized, they're still going to be more organized than a growing tech or a growing support org, right? Because even though we may, especially as a smaller MSP, have consistency amongst our techs at our MSP, if we don't have documented SOPs, or if we don't have a good, well-made RMM with a large amount of automation, right? Getting 2 to 3 new businesses and adding 200 devices to a already full full tech support staff becomes very difficult. So having that tech in place first gives us some leeway. I also err towards that opinion because a salesperson who's doing nothing is always going to be, for lack of a better term, a waste of money, right? A technician, say a tier 3 or a tier 2 tech, who's doing nothing in regards to support calls is always going to be an asset, right? They can go in and start auditing tickets to create an automation motion or look at what needs to be automated inside your organization. They can take time to start training that tier 1 tech who wants to move up in the hierarchy, right? They can go through and start looking at, say, expanding services, right? We don't manage Macs now, but this new tech I'm hiring is a Mac whiz. Okay, well, let's start building out that SOP while our sales team catches up to filling this volume, right? So I always feel, unless you're trying to do something very, very, very quickly with growth, having more techs to force growth is better, if that makes sense to you folks and if that answers the question properly. I am very hesitant to expand a sales team to force any type of growth or to look at growing the machine count in an MSP, especially recently, because I tend to find, especially in my world, I am very picky with the clients that I would bring in to my MSP. I want them to fit my philosophical or my way of doing things. And even bringing in a new salesperson isn't like we're going to immediately bring our sales or grow our sales by whatever increment that would be, right? Having one salesperson adding another, it's not going to double. Having two adding another to make it 3, it's not going to, go up by a third, right? I don't feel that typically happens. So if I'm looking at growing my MSP, I'm always going to be tech hiring first outside of some really rare instances.
So from my perspective, I worked for an MSP. When I started there, they were just over 40 million in revenue. And by the time I left, they were just under 100 million. So during that time, we went through very, very, very rapid growth. We'll just put it that way. And a lot of that wasn't just acquisition, right? Acquisition was a big part of it. So I did the technical due diligence for our VC funding. I also did the technical due diligence on 2 of the 4 MSPs that we brought in. Now, part of that is you're trying to grow revenue by acquisition or merge or what have you. And so I was lucky enough to get that experience. But we also had a very, very aggressive sales motion. So part of that, when I first started, like I started at an MSP that's been around for almost 20 years. They were there's a whole, I could tell a whole hour-long history on who Nitro Microsystems were and how TUC became and fully managed and everything else. Long story short, we realized that operationally we were very kind of archaic in a lot of our processes from an operational point of view. And we realized that our master services agreement really didn't align to like SLAs, that didn't align to our service delivery. And we were kind of trying to be all things for everybody. And that's how, like when you're a VAR, you're trying to wrap product, whether software, hardware, and resell, and then try to wrap some project and some services around it. So basically, kind of that was the whole evolution of managed services going back 10, 15 years. And today, it is more about standardization. So to answer your question, Joe, so I'm not kind of belaboring the point, is that we had a sales team of roughly around 20 people, and it was highly aggressive. And then what we realized, in order to have that kind of sales motion, you really need to have a lot of back end process very, very dialed in. That sales team over a 4-year period went from probably 20 to about 10. And we didn't lose any revenue during that time. So it was a really interesting exercise. And I worked directly. So I didn't work for our COO. She had her kind of own team. She owned the service delivery team and everything. I worked for the CRO, the Chief Revenue Officer. So I was kind of like almost like a dotted line, kind of a pivot between operations team and the sales team. So what I started figuring out was like a lot of sales metrics, what we were selling, and working very closely with our service delivery team on how they were operating and making recommendations on that side, because it's a life cycle within an MSP. If you have one link in the chain that is broken, obviously the entire cycle is broken. So my job was really to kind of take the pains out of the operation and try to figure out how to fix it and everything else. It was a really interesting 4 years that I spent with them. What I can tell you is adding warm bodies to grow isn't always the solution. I'm a very firm believer in operations, whether you're an IT department or whether you're an MSP. If you run a very tight operation, you can accomplish a lot of things that people didn't think you were able to accomplish. Now, how I did that personally, just a kind of sidebar, taking a little off track, is metrics, right? From technicians, from sales, through the entire operation. I was focused on understanding how people were performing, not good or bad. Some of it was bad. And I always gave everybody a chance, like, hey, you're sitting in a chair for 8 to 10 hours a day, and all you're doing is picking up the phone. Now, is that your problem or is that my problem, right? So initially, I made it my problem. And I have a really big problem with, techs that, in terms of operations, like just another sidebar is, I had a really big problem with techs answering the phones and only focusing on remote control. That's how we did it 20 years ago. That's not how we need to do it today, which, by the way, maybe speaks to a bit of your automation strategy that you were mentioning earlier, which is one of the things that I was highly focused on eventually, probably by year 2 or 3. So understanding your operation and aligning your processes to drive growth can be done through metrics and understanding of where your bottlenecks are, right? So to kind of summarize, yes, throwing warm bodies or increasing or adding salespeople to increase revenue is not necessarily the best route. Fact finding and having the understanding of your operations is often the easiest way to grow the operation outside of just throwing people at it.